The typical newborn brain is 333 grams. And in the first 2 years of life, it actually triples in size. It's an extraordinary period of brain growth, unparalleled over the life course. And you can see that here. Here is brain growth over the lifespan. And you can see how steep the rise is early on. Now, we're actually born with a lifetime supply of brain cells or neurons. That's not what actually grows. It's the connections between those brain cells, what we call synapses, that account for that brain growth. And those synapses form based on early experiences. Adults watching this find it discombobulating because your mind is trying to make a coherent narrative out of this, and there is no coherent narrative. It jumps all over the place. But babies aren't trying to make a coherent narrative out of it. They're not capable of doing that. It's all of that screen change, all of that stimulation that's keeping them actually engaged in the screen. So we've had for a while what we call the overstimulation hypothesis, which is that prolonged exposure to this rapid image change during this critical window of brain development would precondition the mind to expect high levels of input. And that would lead to inattention in later life. So you watch enough Baby Einstein Day on the Farm as a baby, and when you go to a farm as a school-age child, it's boring. It's too slow. How come there's no sheep suddenly popping into my face? How come there's no marionette going back and forth? Why do I have to walk from here to there? That's the general idea, that you're conditioning the mind to that reality, which doesn't actually exist.
Are the kids behaving differently online?
You know, it's not so much that they're behaving differently as much as that we have a sense of visibility that we've never seen before. So we're used to being able to see a certain group of kids in certain places, right? The mall, we can see kids hanging out with their friends that way. But as adults, we don't typically have a really good sense of all the kids and a good sense of where they are and what they're doing when they're with their friends. What's going on online is, in many ways, it's youth space. So they're there, they're goofing around as though they're there just with their friends. And so what ends up happening is you can get a sense of what's going on really in broad sweeps. And it isn't just the kids like the kids in your community, but the kids who are in different communities all around the world with all sorts of different ideas of what is normative behavior, right? And that what is normal, what is common really differs. And so we see these behaviors online and we're like, oh my gosh, it's radically different today than it ever was before. It's not really.
I think one of the things that has happened to the first generation of kids to grow up always being online, which by the way are my kids, they have never experienced dial-up or anything like that. They've always had always on. And what I've seen is they have a global awareness that was not present in my generation. They really feel as if this is one world. They also feel as if they are always connected to everyone else. There is a feeling of being connected that I did not have in my generation. And I think the third thing is that there is a sense of movement forward, the sense of going somewhere, of maybe you might call it progress, that I think was not present in previous generations.
I think it's going to be pretty amazing to see how the next generation, I guess, evolves, if you want to call it that, because of their access to technology, but ultimately their access to information. I think education is being redefined. It's not necessarily about memorization. It's about finding, searching for answers. You have an infinite amount of resources available to you, or information available to you. And I think people, or this next generation, I guess are much more knowledgeable about any topic that you can think of. That also, sometimes people think of I guess, the dangers of people trying to trick individuals with deceiving them with information that's not correct, that posting rumors. But again, I think this next generation is potentially more wary, or I guess conscious of that they are making their own decisions. They understand if they're reading a post or about to click on a link, where that's going to take them. So I think everyone's now is kind of conscious of how maybe people are trying to shape their thoughts or feelings. But again, that's not any different than what has happened in the past, I think.
There are now people in their mid to getting on to advanced teens who have never known, obviously, a world without the web. In fact, there may be 20-year-olds who've never known anything about that. Have they developed strange thumbs? Do they have peculiar ways of talking and listening? Do their eyes glaze over when they have to concentrate for more than 30 seconds? No, I don't believe any of that. I'm not particularly negative or pessimistic about the social qualities, the linguistic qualities, the concentration qualities of Generation Web, as they're called. I honestly believe that if you were to go back into the 1920s and take an ordinary, semi-educated 15-year-old and place him next to an ordinary, semi-educated 15-year-old now, you would find the one now knows more, understands more, is more socially confident, is more aware of the rest of the world, is more able and more adept at research, may not be able to say their 9 times table as fluently or repeat amoa masamata mama samatis amant. They may not be able to do that. Is that such a great loss to an old-fashioned person like me? I'd love to think people could do both, but let's get real about this. Connection is what humans crave.
The one thing that keeps coming up is this idea of the exchange of private information. How are kids exchanging or using private information as currency in a different way than perhaps adults are using private information as currency?
Well, again, what constitutes private information, right? From an adult's perspective, it's identifying information is their absolute fear, right? The idea that it's your name, your address, your phone number, anything that will identify you. And this has to do with the idea of physical risk. But for young people, it's about all right, fine, you can call me by my name. Why is that a big deal? It's more about the things that make you vulnerable. And so when we think about privacy and private information, it's really a question of vulnerability. And so from adult perspective, we're really concerned about physical vulnerabilities and increasingly about psychological vulnerabilities. And for a lot of young people, it's about social vulnerabilities. So, how do I make certain that I don't get teased, harassed, bullied because of the things that I make available out there? How do I make certain that what I put out there makes me seem cool and not lame? How do I balance that? So the social vulnerability is the privacy fight for young people. The physical and psychological is the fight for parents. And so we see these two constantly at odds, because part of putting things out in public is to achieve status, you need to actually make yourself vulnerable at a certain level. And how do you actually do that in a way that balances the risks and the benefits?
Sherry, how is this generation different in terms of how much we give to other people in terms of our information?
Well, I think this generation has a sense that information wants to be free and information about themselves wants to be free. And in a way, there's a kind of self-surveillance that I think that young people don't think about in political terms. But it is a political issue. People put their lives on the screen. They put really intimate details of their lives out there, and with very little thought that there might be people using that information in ways that are not benign. I think that it's hard to teach the relationship between privacy and democracy, and it's also hard to teach the relationship between intimacy and privacy. What is intimacy without privacy? I think this is really a question for this generation.
What's interesting is that the information using status updates and instant messaging, etc., is an intimate information.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if it's a loop, it's a feedback loop.
Yeah.
I give you a bit more information, you then give me more information, which then
Right.
creates this incredible flood of information. So as a recipient of all of this information, how do you think this is affecting me?
You start to want to hide. I mean, at first, it's all good. It's all good. I'll give you, you get this kind of what seems like a virtuous cycle of more and more and more. But as we see what this generation looks like as it grows up with it, they're now a generation in retreat. They'll text, but they won't talk. one of the things that has been so, for somebody like me who does interviews and who believes in what you learn from the face, from, the philosophers tell us that we become human when we're confronted with another face through the voice, through the inflection of the voice. These kids don't want to see a face, they don't want to see a voice. They want to text. So that in a way we're no longer nourished but consumed in some way by what we've created. And I think that's very, it's not all good.
Where people make their fundamental error who criticize all this and think it's a danger and that it's reducing our capacity to act as proper human beings, is they think it's all this. You either sit in front of a screen of some kind, or tapping away all your life, going lol, and being childish and not writing in proper English sentences, or you sit in an old-fashioned study with books and you read properly and you engage properly and you go for walks. Well, I do both. And most people do both. It is not one or the other. Now, you may say, I've had the advantage of a classical education. I've grown up in a tradition in which I've understood books and I've understood history and I've been interested in these things and I like Latin and Greek and and I like the smell of a proper book and so on. That's true, but I have made quite a lot of online friends. I don't even know what gender some of them are. They're people I chat with, either personal or direct messaging in forums and Twitter and so on. Some of whom I think are very young, and you can sort of tell they are, and who astonish me occasionally with their knowledge of literature. In fact, I was having a conversation just the other day with one who was talking to me about Evelyn Waugh. And I think she's 12, and she seems to have read every book that Evelyn Waugh ever wrote and have a very intelligent view of this great novelist. And I almost wanted to say, but how would someone who's 12 like you ever have read these books? And I think, what am I saying? Of course they might have done, and spend a lot of their time on a forum as well. It's not, the two are not mutually exclusive.